G'day everybody, good afternoon. My name's Tony Link. I'm a general practitioner in Austинville in northern New South Wales. I'm Chair of Faculty at the Improvement Foundation. So we're joined today, special guest Deb Rawlings. Now Deb, where are you?
I'm in Adelaide, Flinders University, and I was saying before that I'm looking out over the sea as I speak. It's a beautiful sunny day, so we have your sunshine here.
Well, lucky you. We're joined by Alison Konacek in qiCommunity Central, so thank you Alison, controlling the slides, and thank you for all of you who have joined us online. Deb, you're working as part of the End of Life Essentials team as part of the Flinders University, working mainly in acute hospitals.
That's right. End of Life Essentials, it's a Commonwealth funded project, and it provides education for health professionals working in acute hospitals. But while the information and resources is site-specific, much of it's relevant for any health professional working with any patient in any setting who wants to provide good quality, evidence-based end-of-life care. So, for example, things like communication, teamwork, prognostication, imminent death, they're all things that everyone can learn from. And we know for a fact that our communication films are used widely as part of education packages.
So you've produced a number of education modules as part of your work with the team on end-of-life care.
That's right. So this is our homepage from our website, which we refreshed at the end of last year, and we took the chance to update and renew everything. So go in and have a look. There's a wealth of information there. So what we do have are e-learning topics. We now have 10 free online learning modules, and 4 of them were released in December, and they're the ones in red: emergency department, pediatrics, imminent death, and obviously chronic complex illness, which I'll focus on today.
Thank you. So, so the topics we're going to be talking about today then, Deb, are these.
Yeah, so chronic complex illness itself, where do people live and where do they die? And I think important conversations to have with people who have these conditions, and then that leads into self-care, so looking after yourself, working in a team, and then how do you get hold of all of these resources?
So we'll talk about all those resources at the end. Now, Deb, usually when we're speaking about end-of-life care, we're thinking about cancer comes first to mind with somewhat of a predictable death. But today we're talking about end-of-life care in relation to chronic and complex illness. Is that important?
Well, it is, because chronic complex illnesses account for about 90% of all deaths in Australia. And, interestingly, 70% of these deaths are expected, although we can't predict with certainty when these individuals will die because of uncertain disease trajectories. So anyone working in primary care or acute hospitals or in any setting will be familiar with the patients who have these chronic complex illnesses. So it's people with end-stage organ failure, so maybe renal, lung or heart, or people with dementia. They're all common, but they do comprise the leading causes of death in Australia. So it's something that we need to be aware of.
Certainly, and a lot of these people, in fact, would have more than one chronic or complex illness.
Well, they do. But the interesting thing we need to remember first is that chronic complex conditions like these cannot be cured. And as you were saying, we know that many people living with chronic complex conditions have more than one comorbidity. And certainly in one study, it was people living with coronary heart disease. 50% also had high blood pressure, 26% also had diabetes, 14% have had a stroke, 13% also living with heart failure, and 5% also have dementia. It's a familiar scenario that everyone will recognise, but they're not actually always perceived as life-limiting illnesses. There's no cure for any of these conditions, yet many people aren't really aware of that, and nor are their families.
No, that's right. And in fact, we know that towards the end of their life, these people can be very high utilisers of hospitals. And we also know that patients' experience of care is an important predictor of their outcome. What sort of experience do these people with chronic complex comorbidities have towards the end of their life?
Yeah, look, Tom, it can be really an emotional one, and it's often dominated by things like frustration and progressive losses. So maybe loss of independence, things like that, social isolation, the stress of balancing and monitoring a complex medication regime, and just a whole host of symptoms specific to their illness. And we know that acute exacerbations require hospitalisation, and patients will often go in and out regularly. So the ongoing healthcare experiences are distressing and really quite debilitating. And everyone, I think, will be aware that while these patients often bounce back after a course of antibiotics or other treatment, they'll never be quite as well as they were previously. And I think in the pursuit of good quality end-of-life care, it's imperative that healthcare professionals recognise these patterns. And look, what I'm flagging up here is that someone at some point is going to need to start saying this to the patient and family, that this isn't going to go on indefinitely. But that's difficult. And the question I pose is, whose responsibility is it to have those conversations?
Exactly. That's an important question. All of my patients die, Deb, I've discovered, but not all of them have had that discussion with me before that happens. So where do people die, and where do they want to die? Where do they live?
Look, the last year of life, most people we know from a lot of study is that the last year of life is spent at home. So that's under the care of general practitioners and community services. But we also know that up to 82% of people can be admitted to hospital during the last year of life, with 24% of them, that's nearly a quarter, having 3 or more care episodes. So evidence also tells us that a lot of people would like to die at home, but we know that over half will die in hospital, and that's likely to be one of those acute episodes. 32% will die in an aged care facility, and probably only about 14% will die at home. So, as I said earlier, while the focus of end-of-life essentials is on acute hospitals, we never forget that while admission can be frequent in the last year of life, it is the primary care teams who are doing a lot of the care.
And so more than 50%, you said, want to die at home, but only 14%.
Well, they say that the majority of people want to die at home, but yeah, 54% die in hospital, that's right.
So I guess it is very much, given what you've said, as general practice teams, we should start to have these discussions with our patients about end-of-life care. It's amazing to me how often that our patients and their families are ill-prepared for those terminal stages or not accepting of it. You're suggesting that having these discussions earlier in the disease can be helpful for them to cope with the end-of-life period when it comes.
Absolutely. Knowing that this won't go on forever is important for a patient and family to know. So it allows for planning. And, from my experience, you often hear, oh, yeah, no, he always does this. He'll have some antibiotics and bounce back. Well, at some point, he's not going to bounce back and the antibiotics won't work. So offering to discuss early on in a patient's diagnosis or illness about what is likely to occur in the future is important, but uncertainty in prognosis is a major consideration. And they say that predicting the beginning of life is easier, in the end of life, not so much. And yes, we know it's hard to start the conversation. It's not as easy as we'd like to think.
No, certainly we can predict the start of life, plus or minus 2 weeks. Predicting the end of life is fraught, isn't it? And these discussions can be very difficult, even for us, even or especially for those of us who know our patients very well over long periods of time. So you've got some recommendations about what to say and how much to say and who to say it to, Deb? Yeah,
it's sort of trying to stick your toe in the water, really. We know that some patients will want to know everything. And some patients only some things, and there are people who don't want to know anything at all, and are quite happy with that. So it's always best to actually ask And yes, you know, we do have some idea of a series of conversations that can start to take place.
So there's some specific questions we can start to explore the patient's interest in this area.
Yeah, so it can be a series of conversations. So as the illness trajectory will not offer a clear mark of, say, right, at this point, this is when you start talking about end of life. It's asking people about what they would prefer to know. You know, it helps to empower them. How much information would you like to have? Are you the sort of person that wants to know what will happen in the future? Do you have any questions for me about what might happen down the track? This is where we are now. You know, have you thought about whether this can carry on?
So their answer to that question, do you have any questions for me about what might happen down the track? May spark off their thinking along those lines. They, as you said, they may not want to know anything, and that lets us know what sort of position or what sort of patient they are. I don't think I've asked that question, but that's one to add to our handbag of questions, isn't it? So we should be prepared for unexpected questions from a patient.
Yes, I know, and they do come often at very unexpected moments. You know, so some patients may initiate discussions with you, and it's best that you're prepared. And I work with a paediatric palliative care nurse here in Adelaide, and she always says, you know, in the back of her head, she's always got a sort of rescue phrase or something that you can respond with if you're caught off, you know, unexpected. And certainly something I've always used is, you know, if someone say to me, "Am I dying?" And you say, "Well, what makes you say that?" And that really puts the onus on them to think through why they've come up with that question, things that they've been thinking. And the important thing always when you're initiating conversations with patients and their families is to find out where they're coming from, and what they know and what they understand and the words that they use about their illness. So certainly someone that a colleague saw was horrified when she mentioned lung cancer because, well, he had a shadow on his lung, and he didn't quite see that that was the same thing. So, and, you know, sometimes highlighting how things are now as opposed to how they were the last time you saw them. I can see that things have changed a bit, and you know, I can see that you now need help with something else. So sometimes you can prompt things that way.
So there are some specific strategies that you highlight on this slide, which will be available to our listeners that help us with these conversations.
Yes, absolutely. So, and this is from the one of the modules, or the chronic complex illness module. So it's about asking permission to actually talk about these things, to explore someone's understanding, sharing information or as much information as they want to hear, and to clarify the conversation that you're having and what it's about. And certainly, as I said before, there are people who don't want to talk about the future. What you also have to expect and plan for is responding to emotions. This is difficult. For some patients and families, it won't be a shock, and it will be something that perhaps they've already talked about, but for others it won't. And certainly everything needs to be tailored to individuals, and with clear explanations, without the jargon and euphemisms, which we love to use as well.
Yes. And so some tips, Deb, for these conversations?
So yes, always asking permission, as I said. Would you like to discuss what's likely to happen next? Would you like to discuss the future now? Be prepared for strong emotions. And I think certainly as health professionals, we like to try and fix things. But, you know, this isn't necessarily fixable. And we must always, of course, accept that the patient and all the family, and quite often the family, not the patient, or the patient, not the family, are the experts in this. They've been living through the illness, and it will potentially have gone on for many, many years. So certainly, you know, their experiences and is very important. And it's always important to say that we will support you in your decision, and always ask what matters to you right now, what is important to you now, and what is important to you in the future.
Yes, I think that's a very, very person-centered approach, isn't it? Respecting the patient and their family and where they are in their journey towards the ultimate outcome, and
Absolutely.
being very aligned with what their particular needs are at that point.
And it might not match ours, and that's okay.
Yes, sometimes, Deb, it's clear to us that a patient's within the terminal period of their illness. It may not be to them. They're often in denial about that, or refusing to accept that, or their families are. Is that something that you've observed and addressed?
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's providing snippets of information and reminding them sometimes of where they've come from, the journey that I don't necessarily like the word journey, but reminding them of, all of those admissions or all of those illnesses, and, where we are now, and the fact that now is different, and that, we're talking about the urge to fix, and that actually we don't need to, and that just listening and helping, supporting people, I think, is the important thing. And if they don't want to acknowledge,
it's hard work, Deb, sometimes.
Well, it is. No, it absolutely is.
About looking after ourselves.
Well, I think for healthcare professionals working with anyone who's in these situations, or anyone at the end of life, you will respond to overpowering suffering and emotion, and certainly there are things that you need to do to think about, and for people who are working specifically in end-of-life care, and arguably that might be many of us who are looking after these patients, do you find pleasure in the work that you're doing? And something to also think about is, when someone does die, do you pause and reflect on them as a person and someone that you've been involved with? And things like, how do you sustain and cultivate your own humanity? What are your self-care strategies? Who supports you? The things that we need to think of. And certainly, most of you will know what good self-care looks like. But I guess my question is, do you all practice it? And considering caring for people who are dying, and that's in any capacity that you're doing that, whether that's in an ongoing way or infrequently, it can take its toll. And I think you referred to this earlier, Tony, in that you develop ongoing relationships with the people and their families. So, in the face of ongoing losses, and you said earlier that all of the patients die, you need to look after yourself and work out how to practice self-care.
Yes, and you've got some tips there for helping us prevent burnout and distress, including mindful meditation and reflective writing.
Yeah, there's all sorts of strategies, and it'll be individual, and what helps people, and it's something that I think everyone needs to think about.
I tell my patients, I don't tend to attend the funerals of my patients, even though I've known them for a long time. It's just too sad, but when you do go, isn't it interesting how much you learn about the people that you think you knew? You learn so much about their lives. It'd be nice to have that information beforehand when they're still alive sometimes.
Yes, well, I worked in the community out of a hospice for a few years, and visiting people at home is always, to me, you find out so much more when they're taking you on a tour of their rose garden. It means so much more about them as a person.
So we do need strategies or plans for that moment when our patients die. Sometimes they can be ritualistic.
Absolutely, and it's something that I've been interested in quite a lot over the years. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to do this, but certainly you can consider a ritual for ending, what can often be a long-term relationship. And in some intensive care units and emergency departments, they've introduced something called the pause. And it's a minute, if that, of quiet. And that's sometimes at the end of an unsuccessful resuscitation. And in some hospitals, rituals are practiced. And this is something I found interesting for patients who are living organ donors. A guard of honour by hospital staff as they're wheeled into theatre to donate their organs. And in residential aged care facilities, you know, they'll do various different things. Sometimes a guard of honour as the patient is taken out the front door or out the back door, and things like a handmade quilt on a coffin. And certainly in palliative care, what they are very good at is in team meetings, they'll often read out a list of the people who died in the previous week, just to acknowledge them, make sure that everyone's aware that that's happened, and respect the life that they lived and them as an individual. It only takes a minute to say goodbye to someone.
It's very important, and it's important to remember that in a general practice team, it's not only the doctors involved in these patients' lives, it's the receptionists and the practice nurses who know them over a long period of time. And I can see that would be important in practice to have processes to acknowledge the loss of our patients rather than having it surprise to individuals one after the other when they find out.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to the use of teams in end-of-life care. Deb, that's something your team has looked at.
Yes, and I think what we need to remember is that no one health professional has all the skills and knowledge to address and manage end-of-life care needs for everyone or for an individual patient. And teamwork, I think, is crucial in strengthening against the distress that can come from working in this area. You know, with patients and families as a central part of the healthcare team. You know, you're not doing this on your own. You are part of a team, and each team member will bring different skills and knowledge to the care of that patient and family. And certainly many years ago in the hospice, I'd worked there for a while, so I knew who this person was. The family could not say enough about a woman called Celia, and the student nurses didn't know who that was. And it was actually the woman who worked in the kitchen, and she had been of great support to that family, and they wanted to acknowledge that. So she also brought great skills to our team at the time. And I think everyone needs to remember that everyone brings something. And certainly David Currow, who's a professor in palliative care, once said that every person will have a different team around them. Depends on their need. So they might have the doctor, the nurse, and they might have a physio, they might not, might have a social worker, they might have the person in the kitchen who helps them. So, you know, it is all about teams, I think. And effective teamwork itself encompasses leadership, clear goals, clear roles, trust, respect, and certainly a cultural readiness to allow patients to steer the care, because patients are part of the team. And effective end-of-life care certainly does require all of us to be an advocate, but we need to feel safe to speak up within a team, and certainly, you know, teams do need to learn how to work together, and you know, some of that's about changing practice as well.
Yes, and important remembering the patient and their families are very much part of the team, and also that we do have an important role in advocating on behalf of our patients as they approach end-of-life care, and advising them about when to pursue things vigorously and when perhaps to let go. Difficult decisions for families and carers, and an important role for us as part of their primary care team.
Indeed.
So, thank you for that, Deb. In summary.
So, healthcare experiences of people with chronic conditions, it is emotional, and as I said, sometimes marked by several trips to hospital before they die. And I think what we need to be aware of is in conversations about end of life and future care helps people and the families have a choice. What we do need to do is to know our own capacity to initiate end of life conversations. Is it our responsibility? Can we ignore it? I think we know with people who have the exacerbations of their condition, their prognosis really is uncertain, and that's a reality that everyone has to live with. But people need to know that, the patients and families need to know that they're not always going to bounce back, that at some point they will die. We also know that self-care and compassion, satisfaction are important enablers in clinical care, and that's what helps us to carry on. And I think excellent teamwork, self-care, compassionate care can really help improve end-of-life care for the patients and families, and keep us going at the same time.
Absolutely, and a real call to action there you've given us, Deb, to consider end-of-life care early in patients' illness when they have complex and chronic conditions, and give them the opportunity and the space to talk about those issues both with the patients and their families. So thank you so much for that. Now you do have, you mentioned that there are resources available for us and our teams that we can access.
Yeah, so it's through the End of Life Essentials website, which you can Google. So there's a lot of resources in the website to enable and support the provision of good quality end-of-life care. There are the e-learning modules that I spoke about before. There are 10 of them now, very evidence-based, peer-reviewed. There's also an implementation toolkit that's attached to each module, and they're practical changes that you can make in your practice, in your team, and in your workplace. So there's a host of resources that anyone can use and access. And I'm just saying, I think go on and have a look and see what's there, and what you can use.
And they're fairly available to people outside the hospital system?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're absolutely freely. You register for the modules, but they don't cost you anything. You just go in and do them in your own time.
Oh, thank you so much for that. We'll make sure that we look, and I think there's a slide with that address, but it's endoflifeessentials.com.au.
Yeah.
Endoflifeessentials.com. That's a complicated end of word to type, but we'll work it out. Now these slides are available, Alison, for people to download with a bit more detail and numbers. There's a detailed slide pack available for people to download. We can all visit now the www.endoflifeessentials.com.au website. Deb, thank you very much for sharing those resources and that information with us, as you've given us plenty to think about. And thank you for joining us from Flinders today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tony.
And Alison, the qiCommunity next month, topic to be announced.
Correct, yes. And the PowerPoint presentation is available in the materials section, but I'll also send it out when I send out a link for the recording. This has been recorded, so if you want to review it at any stage, I'll let you know once it's available on our YouTube website. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Deb, thank you very much for your time. That was a very interesting session. A bit more personal than I'd like to. I've got a father in aged care who's in the process of early stages of dying, so it's good to have a bit of feedback on a personal level as well. And Tony, of course, as always, thank you very much. So thank you, everyone. As said, the next qiCommunity webinar will be advising once we've got a date set and a topic, and I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.